The gavel never hit the bench. Before Judge Simone Bradford could bring order to her courtroom, before she could speak a single word from behind that elevated desk where justice was supposed to flow without prejudice, a hand grabbed her shoulder from behind. Hard, deliberate. The kind of grip that said you don't belong here. The kind that assumed authority it didn't possess. Officer Brett Callahan's voice cut through the morning quiet of courtroom 6B like a blade. "Ma'am, you need to leave this area immediately. This is a restricted space." The words hung in the air. Cold. Final. Delivered with the confidence of a man who had never been questioned, never been wrong, never faced consequences for assumptions written all over his face. Simone turned slowly. She wore her black judicial robe, the seal of the Superior Court of Cook County visible on her chest. Her name placard sat on the bench behind her, gold letters catching the fluorescent light. Judge Simone Bradford. But Officer Callahan wasn't looking at any of that. He was looking at her face, her skin, and making calculations that had nothing to do with facts. "I'm Judge Bradford," she said evenly. "This is my courtroom." Callahan's hand didn't move from her shoulder. If anything, his grip tightened. "Sure you are," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "And I'm the governor. Now move along before I have to escort you out." Behind him, Officer Shane Murphy stepped forward, hand resting on his belt near his radio. Two uniformed men, both white, both convinced they were right, both about to make the worst mistake of their careers. The courtroom wasn't empty. Attorneys shuffled papers at their tables. A court reporter, Latoya Mitchell, sat frozen at her stenography machine, eyes wide with disbelief. In the gallery, a handful of people waiting for the morning docket to begin watched in stunned silence. And in the back corner, a journalist named Rachel Turner had her phone out, camera already recording. Simone kept her voice steady. "Officer, remove your hand from my shoulder. I am the presiding judge of this courtroom. You are making a serious error." Callahan smirked. "The only error here is you thinking you can waltz into a judge's chamber and pretend you run the place." He looked over his shoulder at Murphy. "Shane, call security. We've got someone trying to impersonate a court official." Murphy reached for his radio, but something in Simone's eyes made him pause. Not fear, not uncertainty, something else. Something that should have warned both men they were standing on the edge of a cliff. Tyrell Johnson, the bailiff assigned to courtroom 6B, came through the side door carrying a stack of files. He froze mid-step when he saw Callahan's hand on Judge Bradford's shoulder. The files slipped from his grasp, scattering across the floor with a sound like thunder. "Get your hands off her," Tyrell said, his voice low and dangerous. "That's Judge Bradford. You're assaulting a sitting judge." Callahan barely glanced at him. "Stay out of this, bailiff. We're handling a security breach." But Tyrell was already moving forward, his badge visible, his face a mask of controlled fury. "There's no breach. You just put your hands on a judge, in her own courtroom, on camera." That's when Callahan seemed to notice the phones. Rachel in the back, recording everything. Two attorneys at the defense table, both with their devices out. Latoya had activated the courtroom's internal recording system, which captured every word, every movement, every catastrophic second of what was unfolding. Callahan's confidence flickered, just for a moment, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. "I don't care who she claims to be. She's not dressed appropriately. She doesn't have proper identification visible, and she's refusing to comply with a lawful order." Simone took a breath. She had been a judge for 6 years. Before that, a prosecutor for 8. Before that, a public defender who had fought for people just like her, people who got profiled, dismissed, erased by a system that looked at skin color before credentials. She had climbed every rung of the legal ladder, earned every title, proved herself 1,000 times over, and now she stood in her own courtroom, wearing her judicial robe, being told by a police officer that she didn't belong. The backstory rose in her mind unbidden. She was 17, sitting in a courtroom in Atlanta, watching her older brother get sentenced for a crime he didn't commit. The judge had barely looked at the evidence. The prosecutor spoke in coded language about dangerous neighborhoods and troubled youth. And Jerome, her brilliant, kind, innocent brother, got 15 years because he fit a profile. Simone had walked out of that courtroom and straight into a library. She studied until her eyes burned, applied to college, then law school, worked 3 jobs to pay for bar exam prep, and when she passed, when she became an attorney, she swore she would never let another person be erased the way her brother had been. But here she was, being erased. Callahan pulled her toward the aisle. "Come on, we're done talking." That's when everything changed. Jerome Hayes, a senior attorney from the public defender's office, stood up from the defense table. "Officer Callahan, I am formally notifying you that you are physically assaulting Judge Simone Bradford, the presiding judge of this courtroom. You are being recorded from multiple angles. If you do not release her immediately, you will be charged with assault on a judicial officer, a felony offense." Callahan stopped, his hand still on Simone's shoulder, but his certainty cracking like ice under weight. Murphy spoke up, voice uncertain now. "Brett, maybe we should check." "Check what?" Callahan snapped. "She's not on the schedule. I looked this morning." Tyrell stepped closer, his voice cutting through. "You looked at the wrong schedule. Judge Bradford presides over courtroom 6B Monday through Thursday. Today is Tuesday. You're assigned to courtroom 3A. You're not even supposed to be on this floor." The silence that followed was suffocating. Callahan's face went through a series of expressions. Confusion, realization, panic. But he still didn't let go. Simone turned to face him fully. "Officer Callahan, you have exactly 5 seconds to remove your hand, step back, and apologize. After that, I will have you arrested and charged, and everything that happens next will be your choice." Callahan's jaw worked. His pride wrestled with reality, and pride won. "I don't take orders from someone who can't even prove who they are," he said. That was the moment, the point of no return. Simone raised her voice, clear and commanding. "Bailiff Johnson, place Officer Brett Callahan under arrest for assault on a judicial officer and contempt of court." Tyrell moved instantly. He had his cuffs out before Callahan could react. "Hands behind your back. Now." Callahan jerked away, releasing Simone but stumbling backward. "Are you insane? You can't arrest me. I'm a police officer." Simone's voice was ice. "And I am a judge in my courtroom where you just assaulted me on camera after being warned multiple times. Officer Murphy, step away from your partner. If you interfere, you will also be charged." Murphy's hands went up immediately. He stepped back, face pale, clearly wanting no part of what was about to happen. But Callahan wasn't done. He looked around the courtroom, at the cameras, the witnesses, the attorneys watching with expressions ranging from shock to grim satisfaction. And then he made his final fatal mistake. He lunged forward, not at Simone, but at Rachel Turner's phone. "Give me that," he shouted, trying to grab the device from her hands. Rachel pulled back, and Callahan stumbled into the gallery railing. The phone stayed in her grip, camera still recording as Callahan's face filled the frame. Red, furious, unhinged. "You're all going to regret this," he snarled. "You think you can set me up? Make me look bad? I know what this is. This is a setup. You put someone in here pretending to be a judge just to make me look racist." The word hung in the air like smoke. Rachel kept recording. LaToya's fingers flew across her stenography machine, and Simone stood perfectly still, letting Callahan's words bury him deeper with every syllable. Jerome spoke up again. "Officer, you are currently being recorded making threats in a courtroom after physically assaulting a sitting judge. I strongly suggest you stop talking." But Callahan was too far gone. "She doesn't look like any judge I've ever seen. How was I supposed to know? She walks in here dressed like she's going to a casual Friday, no ID badge, no announcement, and I'm supposed to just assume she runs the place?" Simone took one step forward. Her voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. "I am wearing my judicial robe, Officer Callahan. My name is on the bench. My photograph is in the courthouse directory. And even if none of that were true, even if I walked in here in street clothes with no identification, You had no authority to put your hands on me without cause. You escalated. You refused to listen. And you did it because you looked at me and decided I didn't belong." Callahan's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, something that might have been fear crossed his face. Tyrell moved in again. "Hands behind your back, last warning." This time, Callahan complied. The cuffs clicked into place, the sound sharp and final. Tyrell recited the charges clearly, his voice steady. "Brett Callahan, you are under arrest for assault on a judicial officer, contempt of court, and attempted destruction of evidence. You have the right to remain silent." As Tyrell led Callahan toward the side door, the officer looked back at Simone one last time. "This isn't over," he said. Simone met his eyes. "You're absolutely right, it's not." The door closed behind them. The courtroom remained silent, and then Rachel Turner spoke, her phone still raised, still recording. "That just happened," she said. "In a Cook County courtroom, a police officer assaulted a black judge, refused to believe her identity, and was arrested on live recording. This is going out everywhere." Simone turned to face the gallery. Her hands were steady, but her heart pounded against her ribs. She looked at the attorneys, the observers, the journalists, and spoke with the authority that had just been questioned, dismissed, and vindicated all in the span of 10 minutes. "Court will convene in 15 minutes, she said. "Anyone who wishes to leave may do so. Anyone who wishes to stay will conduct themselves with respect for this institution, regardless of how it has just been tested." Nobody moved. Nobody left. They sat, waiting, watching, bearing witness to something that felt bigger than one courtroom, one judge, one officer. Something that felt like the beginning of a reckoning. And as Simone took her seat behind the bench, straightened her robe, and opened the docket for the day, she knew with absolute certainty that Brett Callahan had been right about one thing. This was not over, not by a long shot. The video went live within minutes. Rachel Turner uploaded it to 3 platforms simultaneously while still sitting in the gallery. The caption was simple and devastating. "Police officer assaults black judge in her own courtroom, refuses to believe her identity, gets arrested on camera. Cook County today." The first shares came from other journalists in the building who had heard whispers of something explosive happening in courtroom 6B. Then legal professionals, attorneys who knew Judge Bradford's reputation and were horrified by what they saw. Then activists, community organizers, people who had been saying for years that bias in the justice system wasn't just about verdicts and sentences, but about who got respected, who got believed, who got treated as legitimate. Within an hour, the video had 10,000 views. Within 2 hours, 50,000. By lunchtime, it was trending nationally. The Chicago Police Department's communications office started receiving calls before they even knew what had happened. Brett Callahan's name was suddenly everywhere, attached to phrases like excessive force, racial profiling, and judicial assault. His personnel file was requested by a dozen media outlets. His social media accounts, which he had never bothered to make private, were screenshotted and circulated, revealing a pattern of inflammatory posts about activists, protesters, and communities he described in language that made his actions in the courtroom seem less like a mistake and more like a philosophy. But while the video spread and the public outrage built, something else was happening behind closed doors. Something that would determine whether this moment became a footnote or a turning point. Captain Linda Hartley sat in her office on the 3rd floor of the district headquarters, watching the video for the 5th time. She had been a police captain for 12 years, a cop for 26. She had defended officers through tough calls, through split-second decisions made under pressure, through genuine mistakes that came with the weight of the job. But this wasn't any of that. This was an officer ignoring every warning, every piece of evidence, every voice telling him he was wrong because he had decided based on nothing but a glance that the woman in front of him didn't belong. She picked up her phone and called Sergeant Rick Dawson, Callahan's direct supervisor. He answered on the first ring. "I've seen it," Dawson said before she could speak. "It's bad, Linda. It's really bad." How long has he been on your shift? 2 years. Never had a formal complaint. Few minor incidents, but nothing that rose to disciplinary action. Define minor. Dawson hesitated. Aggressive during traffic stops. Couple of verbal altercations with civilians. One incident where a defense attorney claimed he was intimidating a witness outside a courtroom, but it couldn't be substantiated. And you didn't see a pattern? I saw a cop who was assertive. Maybe too assertive sometimes, but not this. Never anything like this. Hartley closed her eyes. Rick, he grabbed a judge in her courtroom while she was wearing her robe, and when multiple people told him who she was, he doubled down. Then he tried to destroy evidence. This isn't assertive. This is an officer who thinks the badge means he can override reality. Dawson didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter. What do you want me to do? Nothing. This is beyond you now. I'm calling the superintendent and the state's attorney. Because if we don't handle this exactly right, we're going to lose the public trust we've spent years trying to rebuild. She hung up and made the next call, this one to Superintendent Harold Griffin, the man at the top of the Chicago Police Department's chain of command. Griffin answered tersely. I'm already in a meeting about this, Linda. Tell me something I don't know. Brett Callahan has a history. Not documented formally, but there's a pattern of behavior that nobody flagged. We need to audit every case he's been involved with, every arrest, every incident report, because if this video shows what I think it shows, we're going to have defense attorneys lining up to challenge his credibility in every case he touched. Griffin swore under his breath. You're talking about hundreds of cases. I'm talking about integrity. If we don't do this voluntarily, the courts will force us to, and it'll look like we were covering up. There was a long pause. Then Griffin said, Get it started. Pull his records. And Linda, I want you to personally oversee this. No one else. I need someone I trust. Understood. She hung up and sat back in her chair. Her phone buzzed immediately. Text messages, emails, other officers asking what was going on, whether Callahan was really under arrest, whether the video was real. She ignored all of it and opened her computer, pulling up Callahan's personnel file. As she read, a picture began to form, not of a rogue officer, but of someone who had been operating with impunity for years because the small warning signs had been dismissed, excused, or buried under the assumption that he was just doing his job. Back in courtroom 6B, Judge Simone Bradford was finishing her morning docket. She moved through each case with precision, her voice calm, her rulings measured. But everyone in the room could feel the tension humming beneath the surface. Attorneys were respectful to the point of deference. Defendants stood a little straighter. Even the prosecutors, who usually approached the bench with casual confidence, spoke carefully, aware that the woman presiding over them had just been publicly disrespected in a way that would have broken someone with less steel in their spine. During a brief recess, Jerome Hayes approached the bench. Judge Bradford, if you need to take the rest of the day, no one would question it. Simone looked at him steadily. If I leave now, Officer Callahan's actions win. He wanted me out of this courtroom. I'm staying. Jerome nodded, understanding. For what it's worth, what you did today mattered. Not just for you, for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. Simone's expression softened just slightly. Thank you, Jerome, but we both know this is just the beginning. He left, and Simone sat alone behind the bench, the courtroom empty except for LaToya, who was quietly organizing transcripts. The court reporter looked up and met Simone's eyes. Judge, can I say something off the record? Simone nodded. I've been working in this courthouse for 8 years. I've seen a lot, but I've never seen anyone handle something like that with the composure you showed. You didn't yell. You didn't escalate. You just stood there and let him hang himself with his own words. Simone smiled faintly. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to react the way people expect you to. LaToya hesitated, then spoke again. My daughter starts law school next year. She wants to be a judge one day. When I tell her about today, I'm going to tell her that justice isn't just about the law. It's about who has the strength to stand in a room and demand respect even when everything around them says they don't deserve it. Simone's throat tightened. She nodded once, unable to speak for a moment. Then she cleared her throat and said, "Tell your daughter I look forward to calling her colleague one day." The afternoon session began. As Simone presided over case after case, her mind drifted periodically to what was happening beyond the courtroom walls. She knew the video was spreading. She knew her name was being discussed in newsrooms, living rooms, police precincts, and political offices. She knew this moment would define her in ways she couldn't yet predict. But what she didn't know yet was just how deep the consequences would run. How many people would be forced to reckon with their own assumptions? How many systems would be interrogated because of what happened in courtroom 6B on a Tuesday morning in Chicago? And how many lives would change because one officer made the catastrophic mistake of thinking a black woman in a judicial robe couldn't possibly be a judge? By evening, the video had been viewed over 2 million times. News outlets across the country picked up the story, playing the footage on loop. Legal analysts dissected every second, pointing out the moment Officer Callahan could have stopped, could have apologized, could have walked away. Instead, they noted, he escalated repeatedly, ignored evidence, and revealed a mindset that assumed authority based on appearance rather than fact. The Chicago Tribune ran a front-page story titled "Judge Assaulted in Courtroom, Officer Arrested After Refusing to Believe Her Identity." The article included background on Judge Simone Bradford, her career trajectory, her reputation for fairness, and her history as a public defender before ascending to the bench. But it also included something else, a quote from a former defendant who had appeared before her 3 years earlier. "Judge Bradford gave me a second chance when no one else would. She saw me as a person, not just a case number. What happened to her today is exactly what she's been fighting against her whole career." The op-eds started appearing by mid-afternoon. Some from legal scholars arguing that the incident revealed systemic failures in police training and accountability. Others from civil rights advocates who pointed out that what happened to Judge Bradford happened to countless people every day, people who didn't have the title, the authority, or the platform to fight back. One piece, written by a retired judge from New York, went viral within hours. It was titled, "I Believe Her Because I've Lived It." The author, a black man who had served on the bench for 30 years, described his own experiences being stopped by security in courthouses, being questioned about his presence in judges' chambers, being mistaken for a defendant despite wearing his robe. "The difference," he wrote, "is that Judge Bradford had cameras recording. Most of us suffer these indignities in silence because we know that speaking up means being labeled difficult, angry, or unprofessional. She didn't have that choice, and because she didn't, we all finally have proof of what we've been saying for decades." Social media exploded with personal stories, attorneys sharing times they'd been mistaken for defendants, black professionals recounting moments they'd been questioned in spaces they had every right to occupy. The hashtag that emerged wasn't angry or inflammatory. It was simple, direct, and devastating. "I believe her." But not everyone was sympathetic. Pushback came swiftly from certain corners. Police unions issued statements defending Callahan, calling the incident a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by media bias. Some commentators argued that Judge Bradford should have been more understanding, that officers make mistakes under pressure, that arresting Callahan was an overreaction. One particularly inflammatory segment on a cable news channel featured a host questioning why Judge Bradford hadn't simply shown identification immediately. If she had just pulled out a badge, shown some ID, this whole thing could have been avoided, the host argued. Instead, she let it escalate. It almost seems like she wanted this to happen. The response was immediate and fierce. Legal experts flooded social media pointing out that judges are not required to carry identification in their own courtrooms, that the burden was on Callahan to verify his assumptions before putting his hands on someone, and that blaming Bradford for Callahan's actions was textbook victim blaming. Jerome Hayes, the attorney who had stood up in court that morning, appeared on 3 different news programs that evening. Each time he made the same points clearly and forcefully. Judge Bradford was in her courtroom, wearing her judicial robe, with her name on the bench. She identified herself verbally multiple times. Officer Callahan chose not to believe her. That's not a mistake. That's bias. And the law is clear. You don't get to assault someone just because you don't believe they are who they say they are. In the district attorney's office, Paul Richardson sat in a conference room with his senior prosecutors, watching the video for what felt like the 100th time. Richardson was a careful man, politically savvy, known for his ability to navigate complex cases without alienating either the police department or the community. But this case was different. This case had no middle ground. "We have to charge him," said one of the prosecutors, a young woman named Amanda Cole, who had worked with Judge Bradford when they were both public defenders. "If we don't, the message is clear. Officers can assault judges and face no consequences." Richardson nodded slowly. "I agree. But we need to be strategic about this. If we overcharge, we risk a jury acquitting him out of sympathy for law enforcement. If we undercharge, we look weak." Another prosecutor, an older man named Frank Delgado, spoke up. "The charges are straightforward. Assault on a judicial officer, contempt of court, attempted destruction of evidence, all supported by video and witness testimony. This isn't complicated, Paul. We charge what the evidence supports and let the jury decide." Richardson looked around the room. Every face showed the same resolve. This wasn't a case anyone wanted to lose, but it also wasn't a case anyone wanted to win for the wrong reasons. They needed to do this right. "All right," Richardson said finally. "We file charges tomorrow morning, full press conference, and we make it clear that this isn't about politics or optics. It's about the rule of law. If a police officer can assault a judge in her own courtroom and face no consequences, then the entire justice system collapses." Across town, in a small apartment in Pilsen, Officer Brett Callahan sat on his couch staring at his phone. His lawyer, a defense attorney named Greg Martin, who specialized in representing cops, had told him to stay off social media, avoid reporters, and say nothing to anyone. But Callahan couldn't help himself. He scrolled through the comments, the articles, the outrage directed at him like a tidal wave. He didn't understand it. He had done his job. He had seen someone who didn't look right, didn't act right, didn't fit the profile of what a judge should be. And he had acted. That's what cops did. They made judgments. They assessed situations. They protected spaces from people who didn't belong. But now somehow, he was the villain. The video made him look bad, he knew that. But it didn't show the full context. It didn't show that he had been assigned to courthouse security for weeks and had never seen this woman before. It didn't show that she had no visible ID, no badge, nothing that immediately identified her as a judge. And it definitely didn't show what he was thinking in that moment. That black woman in judicial robe equals imposter. That assumption, so deeply embedded he didn't even recognize it as bias, had destroyed his career in under 10 minutes. His phone buzzed, a text from Shane Murphy, the other officer who had been in the courtroom that morning. "They're coming for me too. Internal Affairs wants a statement. What do I say?" Callahan stared at the message. He didn't respond. Because the truth was, he didn't know what Murphy should say. He didn't know what he himself should say. The script he had lived by his entire career, the one that said trust your instincts, back your fellow officers, never admit fault. That script had just been revealed as a lie. Back at the courthouse, Simone Bradford sat in her chambers long after the building had emptied. Her robe hung on a hook by the door. Her desk was covered with case files, motions, briefs that needed review, but she couldn't focus on any of it. Instead, she sat in the quiet and let herself feel what she had been holding back all day. The anger, the humiliation, the exhaustion of being doubted, dismissed, and disbelieved in a space she had earned the right to occupy. She thought about her brother, Jerome, still in prison, still fighting for exoneration after 18 years. She thought about all the times she had stood in front of judges as a young attorney and wondered if they saw her or just a stereotype. She thought about the hundreds of people who had appeared before her bench, many of them black and brown, many of them treated by the system as guilty until proven innocent. And she thought about the choice she had made that morning, to stand her ground, to demand respect, to refuse to leave her own courtroom just because a man with a badge told her she didn't belong. It had been the right choice. She knew that, but it had also been a costly one, because now she wasn't just a judge. She was a symbol, and symbols didn't get to be complicated, vulnerable, or uncertain. Symbols had to be strong, unshakable, perfect. Her phone buzzed. A text from her younger sister, Nicole. "I saw the video. Are you okay?" Simone typed back slowly. "I'm okay. Tired, but okay." Another buzz. This time from an unknown number. She almost didn't open it, but something made her look. The message was short. "Thank you for not backing down. You reminded me why I went to law school. You reminded me that we belong everywhere we choose to stand." Simone closed her eyes. She didn't know who had sent it, but she knew why it mattered. Because this moment wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been told they were in the wrong place, who had ever been questioned for existing in spaces they had every right to occupy. And whether she liked it or not, Simone Bradford had just become the face of that fight. She turned off her phone, gathered her files, and left her chambers. The courthouse was dark and quiet. Her footsteps echoed in the empty hallways. But as she walked toward the exit, she felt something shift inside her. Not peace, exactly, but purpose. Tomorrow, the fight would continue. Charges would be filed. Investigations would begin. Media attention would intensify. And somewhere in all of that noise, the justice system would have to reckon with a simple, undeniable truth. A police officer had assaulted a black judge in her own courtroom because he didn't believe she could be who she said she was. And America was watching. The charges were filed at 9 in the morning, exactly 24 hours after Officer Brett Callahan had put his hands on Judge Simone Bradford. District Attorney Paul Richardson stood at a podium in the main lobby of the courthouse, flanked by senior prosecutors and representatives from the Police Oversight Board. The cameras formed a wall of lenses and lights, every major outlet in Chicago present, along with national networks who had sent correspondents overnight. Richardson's statement was brief and unambiguous. Yesterday, in courtroom 6B of this building, a sworn police officer assaulted a sitting judge. That officer has been charged with assault on a judicial officer, a felony carrying a maximum sentence of 5 years. He has also been charged with contempt of court and attempted destruction of evidence. These charges are supported by video evidence, witness testimony, and the officer's own recorded statements. This office will prosecute this case with the full weight of the law. A reporter shouted a question before Richardson could step away. "Are you concerned about backlash from the police union?" Richardson paused, then returned to the microphone. "I'm concerned about justice. This isn't about politics or public relations. This is about a clear violation of law captured on camera. If we fail to prosecute this case, we send a message that judicial officers can be assaulted with impunity. That's not a message this office will ever send." Another question: what about Officer Callahan's claim that he didn't recognize Judge Bradford? Richardson's expression hardened. "Ignorance is not a defense. Officer Callahan had multiple opportunities to verify Judge Bradford's identity. He was told by the bailiff, by attorneys in the courtroom, and by Judge Bradford herself. He chose not to believe them. That choice has consequences." The press conference ended, but the questions didn't. Media vans lined the street outside the courthouse. Reporters stopped attorneys, staff, anyone who might have insight into what happened. Most declined to comment, but a few spoke on background, describing Judge Bradford as professional, fair, and widely respected. One attorney said, "If this had happened to a white male judge, the officer would have been fired on the spot and charged within hours. The fact that some people are still defending Callahan tells you everything you need to know about how bias works. Inside the courthouse, life went on, but nothing felt normal. Security had been increased, not because of threats, but because media attention had turned the building into a spectacle. Judges moved through hallways avoiding cameras. Staff whispered in break rooms. And in courtroom 6B, Judge Simone Bradford prepared for another day on the bench. Before the morning session began, Tyrell Johnson, the bailiff who had arrested Callahan, stopped by her chambers. He knocked softly, waiting for permission to enter. "Come in," Simone called. Tyrell stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Judge, I wanted to check in, see how you're holding up." Simone gestured for him to sit. "I'm managing. Thank you for what you did yesterday. You didn't hesitate." Tyrell shook his head. "No hesitation needed. What he did was wrong. Clear as day. I just did my job. A lot of people wouldn't have. They would have deferred to the officer, assumed he had a reason, let the situation play out differently." Tyrell met her eyes. "Judge, I've been a bailiff for 10 years. I've seen how people get treated based on what they look like. I've seen good people get dismissed, questioned, humiliated because someone in authority made an assumption. What Callahan did to you, he's done to others. Maybe not judges, but people who couldn't fight back the way you did. I wasn't about to let it slide." Simone nodded slowly. "Have you heard anything about how the department is handling this? Unofficially, they're scrambling. Internal Affairs is reviewing every case Callahan touched. His partner Murphy is cooperating fully. Word is he's horrified by what happened and wants nothing to do with Callahan's defense." "And Callahan?" "Silent. His lawyer told him not to talk to anyone, but his union is making noise. They're framing it as a misunderstanding, claiming he was just following protocol for unidentified individuals in restricted areas." Simone's jaw tightened. "I was wearing a judicial robe with my name on the bench. There's no protocol that justifies what he did." Tyrell nodded. "Everyone knows that. But they're going to fight anyway. Because if Callahan goes down, it opens the door to questions about how many other officers operate the same way." Simone was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good. Let those questions get asked." Tyrell stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Judge, one more thing. My wife wanted me to tell you something. She's a teacher, works in Inglewood. She showed that video to her students yesterday, told them that when someone tries to make you small, you stand tall and let the truth speak for itself. Those kids needed to see that. So thank you." After he left, Simone sat alone with those words. She hadn't thought about the impact beyond the immediate situation, beyond the charges and the investigation. But Tyrell's wife was right. Somewhere, young people were watching, learning that standing up to injustice didn't always mean shouting or fighting. Sometimes it meant staying calm, speaking clearly, and refusing to be moved. The morning docket proceeded without incident. By midday, the courthouse had settled into a tense routine. But outside, the story continued to grow. The police union held its own press conference at noon. The union president, a veteran officer named Bill Kowalski, stood before cameras and delivered a carefully worded statement that managed to defend Callahan without directly contradicting the video evidence. "Officer Brett Callahan has served this city with distinction for 8 years. He has made hundreds of arrests, responded to countless calls, and put his life on the line to protect this community. Yesterday, he made a judgment call in what he believed was a security situation. Was it the right call? With hindsight, clearly not, but officers don't have the luxury of hindsight. They have to make split-second decisions based on the information available to them." A reporter interrupted. "He had multiple people telling him she was a judge. That's not split-second, that's refusal to listen." Kowalski's expression hardened. "Officer Callahan is entitled to due process just like any other citizen. Rushing to judgment based on a viral video is exactly the kind of mob mentality we should be fighting against, not encouraging." Another reporter pressed. "Are you saying the video is misleading?" "I'm saying context matters. And the full context of what happened in that courtroom won't be known until all the facts come out in court." But the union's defense rang hollow to many who watched the video, because the context was clear. A judge, in her courtroom, wearing her robe, being physically removed by an officer who refused to believe her identity despite overwhelming evidence. By afternoon, the story had reached national political figures. Congressional representatives issued statements. Civil rights organizations called for federal review of the Chicago Police Department's policies, and the White House press secretary was asked about the incident during the daily briefing. The president believes in due process and trusts that the justice system will handle this case appropriately, the press secretary said. But he also believes that what we saw on that video speaks to larger systemic issues that must be addressed. No one, regardless of their position or title, should be subjected to that kind of treatment based on assumptions about who they are. It was a carefully neutral statement designed to acknowledge the incident without inflaming either side. But it signaled something important. The story had transcended local news. It had become a national conversation about race, authority, and the assumptions embedded in systems of power. That evening, Simone received a call from an unexpected source. The Judicial Conference of the United States, the national policy-making body for federal courts, requested a meeting. They wanted to hear directly from her about what had happened and discuss potential reforms to courthouse security protocols. She agreed to the meeting, scheduled for the following week in Washington, but as she hung up the phone, she felt the weight of what was being asked of her. She wasn't just a judge anymore. She was becoming an advocate, a voice for change, whether she had asked for that role or not. Her phone rang again. This time it was her mother, calling from Atlanta. "Baby, I saw what happened," her mother said, her voice thick with emotion. "Are you all right?" "I'm okay, Mama, really. You shouldn't have to deal with this. Not after everything you've worked for." Simone closed her eyes. "Maybe I do. Maybe this is exactly what I've been working for. Not to be treated like this, but to be in a position where I can fight back when it happens." Her mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Your brother called me from prison. He saw the video too. He said to tell you he's proud of you. He said you did what he never got the chance to do. Stand up and make them listen." Simone's throat tightened. Jerome, her brilliant older brother, who had been stolen from them by a system that looked at him and saw a threat instead of a person. He was serving year 19 of a sentence he should never have received, still fighting for exoneration, still hoping for justice that seemed to move further away with every passing year. "Tell him I love him," Simone said quietly, "and tell him I'm not stopping. Not with this case, not with any of it." "I know you won't, baby. You never have." After her mother hung up, Simone sat in the growing darkness of her chambers. She thought about the path that had led her here. The scholarship to college she had earned by working overnight shifts at a grocery store. The law school loans she was still paying off. The years as a public defender, fighting for clients who couldn't afford anyone else. The judgeship she had campaigned for, knocking on doors, attending community meetings, earning trust one conversation at a time. She had never taken the easy path, and she had never expected the system to treat her fairly just because she had followed the rules. She knew better. She had watched her brother get devoured by that system. She had represented hundreds of clients who faced judges that looked at them with suspicion before they even spoke. But she had also believed, maybe naively, that once she reached a certain level, once she had the title and the robe and the authority, the disrespect would stop. That assumption had been shattered yesterday in her own courtroom. Yet somehow that shattering had opened something up, not just for her, but for everyone who had been watching. The video had done what years of reports and studies and speeches had failed to do. It had made the invisible visible. It had forced people to confront the bias they preferred to pretend didn't exist. A knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. She called out, and Jerome Hayes stepped inside, the attorney who had stood up in her courtroom the day before. "Judge Bradford, I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to give you something." He held out a folder. Simone took it, opening it to find a stack of letters, handwritten notes on different types of paper, some on legal pads, some on notebook paper, one on the back of a court document. "These started arriving today," Jerome said. From people who've appeared in your courtroom over the years, defendants, witnesses, victims. They heard what happened and wanted you to know what your fairness meant to them. Simone read the first letter. It was from a young man she had sentenced to probation instead of jail time 3 years earlier, giving him a chance to complete his education and stay with his family. Judge Bradford, you saw me as a person when everyone else saw a statistic. You gave me a second chance that changed my life. I'm graduating college next month. That's because of you. What happened to you in that courtroom is wrong, but it doesn't surprise me. People who look like us have to prove ourselves every single day. You proved yourself a long time ago. Don't let anyone make you doubt that. Simone felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back, reading another letter, then another. Stories of fairness, second chances, moments where her decisions had altered the trajectory of someone's life. I thought you should see these, Jerome said softly. Because whatever happens with the Callahan case, whatever noise comes from the media or the unions or the politicians, you need to remember why you're here. It's not just about that one moment. It's about every moment before it and every moment that comes after. Simone looked up at him. Thank you, Jerome. This means more than you know. He nodded and turned to leave, but paused at the door. One more thing. A group of attorneys is organizing a rally outside the courthouse tomorrow. They're calling it Stand with Justice. It's not just about you. It's about demanding accountability across the system. I thought you should know. After he left, Simone read through all the letters, each one a reminder that her work mattered, that the choices she made from behind the bench rippled outward in ways she couldn't always see. But they were also a reminder of the stakes. Because if an officer could assault her with impunity, could dismiss her authority based on nothing but her appearance, then what chance did these letter writers have? What chance did any person without a title, without cameras, without witnesses have when they encountered that same bias? The fight wasn't just about her. It never had been. It was about a system that needed to change, needed to be held accountable, needed to stop protecting those who abused their power while punishing those who dared to challenge it. Simone gathered the letters, placed them carefully back in the folder, and set it on her desk where she would see it every morning. Then she put on her coat, turned off the lights, and left her chambers. Tomorrow would bring more cameras, more questions, more pressure, but it would also bring the chance to keep fighting, to keep standing, to keep demanding that the system live up to the promises it made but so often failed to keep. And as Simone Bradford walked out of the courthouse into the Chicago night, she knew with absolute certainty that she would not stop until those promises became reality. Not for herself, but for everyone who came after her. The rally began at 8 in the morning, an hour before the courthouse officially opened. What started as a gathering of a few dozen attorneys quickly swelled into hundreds, then over 1,000. They filled the plaza in front of the building, a sea of suits and briefcases mixed with community members, students, activists, and ordinary citizens who had seen the video and felt compelled to show up. Signs dotted the crowd. Justice for Judge Bradford. Respect the bench. Bias has no place in our courts. But the most common sign, carried by people of all ages and backgrounds, simply read, I believe her. Rachel Turner, the journalist who had recorded the original video, stood at the edge of the crowd with her camera, documenting everything. She had barely slept in 2 days, fielding interview requests, writing follow-up articles, watching her footage get dissected frame by frame on national television. But she was here because she knew this moment mattered. A makeshift stage had been set up, and speakers took turns addressing the crowd. The first was an attorney named Claudia Morris, who had practiced before Judge Bradford for years. I've stood in front of many judges in my career, Claudia said, her voice amplified across the plaza. Some treated me with respect, some didn't. Judge Bradford always did. She listened. She weighed evidence carefully. She gave every person in her courtroom, defendant or victim, the dignity they deserved. What happened to her 2 days ago wasn't just an assault on her. It was an assault on the very idea that competence, credentials, and character matter more than appearance. The crowd applauded. Then another speaker took the stage, a law student named Terrence Robinson who had interned in Judge Bradford's chambers the previous summer. "Judge Bradford taught me that being a judge isn't about power," Terrence said. "It's about responsibility. Responsibility to the law, to the facts, and to the people who come before you seeking justice." Officer Callahan forgot that judges are people. Human beings who deserve the same respect and presumption of legitimacy he expects for himself. He saw a black woman and decided she couldn't be who she said she was. That's not a mistake. That's racism. The word hung in the air. Some in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded in agreement, because that was the word no one in official positions wanted to say out loud, even though everyone who watched the video knew it was true. Inside the courthouse, Captain Linda Hartley was finishing her review of Brett Callahan's case history. What she had found was damning. Over the past 5 years, Callahan had been involved in 37 arrests where defense attorneys questioned his credibility. In 12 cases, judges had suppressed evidence due to concerns about his testimony. In 6 cases, charges had been dropped entirely after prosecutors determined Callahan's reports were inconsistent with video evidence. And in every single case where credibility was questioned, the defendant had been black or Latino. Hartley compiled the data into a report and sent it to Superintendent Griffin with a cover note. "This isn't an isolated incident. This is a pattern, and we missed it." Griffin read the report in silence, his face growing darker with each page. When he finished, he picked up the phone and called the mayor's office. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "A bigger problem than we thought." At the same time, in the district attorney's office, prosecutors were preparing their case. They had the video, the witness statements, the audio recording from the courtroom. But they also knew that convicting a police officer was notoriously difficult. Juries tended to give law enforcement the benefit of the doubt, even in cases with clear evidence of wrongdoing. Amanda Cole, the prosecutor assigned to lead the case, sat in a conference room with her team going over strategy. "We can't just rely on the video," she said. "We need to show pattern. We need to show that Callahan's behavior wasn't a one-time mistake, but part of a larger problem with how he approaches his job." Frank Delgado nodded. "Hartley's report gives us that. 37 questionable arrests, multiple cases where his testimony was thrown out. We can establish that he has a history of letting his assumptions override facts. But we have to be careful," Amanda cautioned. "If we turn this into a referendum on policing in general, we risk losing jurors who support law enforcement. We need to keep it focused on Callahan's specific actions and choices." Paul Richardson, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "We also need to prepare for the defense strategy. They're going to argue that Callahan was just doing his job, that he had reason to be suspicious, that Judge Bradford could have avoided the whole situation by showing ID." Amanda's expression hardened. She shouldn't have to show ID in her own courtroom. That's the entire point. "I agree," Richardson said, "but the defense will paint her as uncooperative. They'll suggest she was testing him, setting him up for failure. We need to be ready to counter that narrative." Back outside, the rally was reaching its peak. The crowd had grown to nearly 2,000 people, spilling into the surrounding streets. News helicopters circled overhead. And then, unexpectedly, Judge Simone Bradford appeared. She hadn't planned to attend. She had planned to stay in her chambers, continue her work, avoid the spectacle. But something had pulled her to the window, and when she saw the crowd, saw the signs, saw the faces of people who had come to stand in solidarity, she made a decision. She walked out through the main entrance of the courthouse, still wearing her judicial robe. The moment the crowd saw her, a roar went up. Applause, cheers, shouts of support. People pressed forward, not aggressively but urgently, wanting to be close to her, to show their support. Simone walked slowly through the crowd toward the stage. People reached out to touch her arm, her hand, to say thank you. She saw tears on faces, saw people holding their children up to see her, saw something that looked like hope and validation mixed together. When she reached the stage, the crowd fell silent. Simone stood at the microphone, looking out over thousands of faces. She hadn't prepared a speech. She hadn't even decided to come until moments before. But now, standing here, she knew what she needed to say. 2 days ago, I walked into my courtroom to do my job, she began, her voice steady and clear. I wasn't looking for attention. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I was just there to serve justice, the way I've done every day for 6 years. But Officer Callahan looked at me and decided I didn't belong. He decided that a black woman in a judicial robe couldn't possibly be a judge. The crowd murmured in agreement. Simone continued, "What happened to me happens to countless people every single day. People who are questioned in spaces they have every right to occupy. People who are told they don't look like they belong. People who have to prove themselves over and over again while others are simply believed. The difference is, I had cameras. I had witnesses. I had the authority and the platform to fight back. Most people don't." She paused, scanning the crowd. "So this isn't just about me. This is about every person who has been dismissed, doubted, or disrespected based on nothing but appearance. This is about demanding that our institutions live up to their promises of equal treatment and equal justice. And this is about saying, loudly and clearly, that we will not accept a system where some people have to prove their humanity while others have it assumed." The applause was deafening, but Simone raised her hand, asking for quiet. "I'm grateful for your support, but support isn't enough. We need action. We need reforms that hold officers accountable when they abuse their power. We need training that addresses implicit bias, not just in theory, but in practice. We need systems that protect people who speak up, not punish them. And we need every person who watched that video and felt outrage to channel that outrage into sustained pressure for change." She looked directly into the cameras. "Officer Callahan will face justice. But one officer facing consequences doesn't fix the system that allowed him to operate unchecked for years. We have to fix that system, and we have to start now." The crowd erupted again. Simone stepped back from the microphone, and several other speakers came forward. But her words had set the tone. This wasn't just a moment of solidarity, it was a call to action. As the rally continued, Simone made her way back into the courthouse. She was stopped multiple times by staff, by attorneys, by people who wanted to thank her or share their own stories. She listened to each one, knowing that these conversations were just as important as the speech she had just given. In her chambers, she found a message waiting. It was from the Judicial Conduct Board, informing her that they had launched an inquiry into courthouse security protocols and requesting her input on potential reforms. Another message came from a national civil rights organization asking if she would be willing to testify before Congress about bias in the justice system. She sat down at her desk, looking at the stack of case files that still needed her attention. Her regular work hadn't stopped. People still needed justice. Cases still needed to be heard. And she was still a judge, first and foremost. But she was also something else now, a catalyst, a symbol, a voice for people who had been silent for too long. Her phone rang. It was her brother's attorney, calling from Atlanta. "Judge Bradford, I wanted you to know that we're filing a new appeal for Jerome. The publicity around your case has brought attention to his conviction. We've got 3 legal clinics offering to help, and a forensic expert has agreed to review the evidence pro bono." Simone's breath caught. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious. Your brother's case has all the hallmarks of the bias you experienced. Rushed investigation, questionable witness testimony, a prosecutor who assumed guilt based on appearance. We think we have a real shot at overturning the conviction." Tears filled Simone's eyes. "Thank you. Thank you for not giving up on him." "We should be thanking you. What you did, standing up the way you did, it reminded people that the system fails people every day. And sometimes when one person stands up, it opens doors for others." After she hung up, Simone sat in silence, letting the weight of those words settle over her. She had stood up for herself, but in doing so, she had created space for others to stand up too. For her brother, for the people who wrote her letters, for everyone who had been waiting for someone with power to say that the system was broken and needed to change. That evening, the news coverage shifted. What had started as a story about one incident was now expanding into a broader conversation about justice system reforms. Panels of experts debated police accountability. Attorneys appeared on talk shows discussing implicit bias, and ordinary people shared their own experiences on social media, adding to a growing chorus of voices demanding change. But not everyone was on board. The police union doubled down on its defense of Callahan. Conservative commentators accused Simone of grandstanding, and anonymous threats began appearing in her email and voicemail, ugly messages from people who saw her not as a judge seeking respect, but as a troublemaker attacking law enforcement. The courthouse increased security around her chambers. Tyrell Johnson personally escorted her to and from the building each day, and Captain Hartley, despite her position in the police department, quietly reached out to offer her personal contact information. "If you ever feel unsafe, call me directly," Hartley said during a brief meeting in Simone's chambers. "I know my department failed you, but I won't fail you again." Simone appreciated the gesture, but she also knew that individual promises weren't enough. The system needed to change, and change required more than good intentions. As the week drew to a close, Brett Callahan made his first court appearance. He stood before a judge, not Judge Bradford, but a senior magistrate named Harold Klein, and entered a plea of not guilty. His lawyer argued that the charges were politically motivated, that his client was being scapegoated to satisfy public outrage. Judge Klein was unmoved. "Mr. Callahan, you are charged with assaulting a sitting judge in her own courtroom. The evidence against you includes video footage, audio recordings, and multiple witness statements. Your plea is noted, but I'm setting bail at $50,000 and requiring you to surrender your passport. You are also prohibited from entering any courthouse except for your own legal proceedings." Callahan's face remained impassive, but his hands clenched into fists. As he was led out of the courtroom, reporters shouted questions. He ignored them all. Outside, his lawyer made a brief statement. "Officer Callahan maintains his innocence. This was a misunderstanding that has been blown out of proportion by media attention and political pressure. We look forward to presenting our case in court and trust that a jury will see the truth." But the public wasn't buying it. The video was too clear, the evidence too strong, and the pattern documented in Captain Hartley's report too damning. That night, Simone sat in her living room, exhausted but unable to sleep. She turned on the television and saw her own face staring back at her from multiple channels. News analysis, op-eds, panel discussions, all centered on the question of what would happen next. She changed the channel and found a local program featuring interviews with community members. An elderly black woman spoke directly to the camera. "I raised 5 sons in this city. Every single one of them has been stopped by police for no reason except walking while black. One of them was arrested for sitting in his own car outside our house because an officer didn't believe he lived there. When I see what happened to Judge Bradford, I see what happens to my boys every day. Except she has a title and a robe. They just have their dignity. And that's not enough for some people." Another person, a young white man, spoke next. "I've never experienced what Judge Bradford experienced. No one has ever questioned whether I belong somewhere based on how I look. That's privilege. And seeing that video made me realize how often I've been given the benefit of the doubt that others don't get. We have to do better, all of us." Simone turned off the television. She didn't need to watch anymore. She knew the conversation was happening. She knew change was starting, however slowly, however imperfectly. But she also knew the hard part was just beginning. The trial would be difficult, the scrutiny would be relentless, and the resistance to change would be fierce. Yet as she finally closed her eyes that night, Simone felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not just hope, but certainty. Certainty that she had done the right thing, certainty that standing up mattered, and certainty that no matter what happened next, she would not back down. Because justice wasn't just about winning cases or changing laws. It was about refusing to accept a world where some people had to prove they belonged, while others never had to question their place. And Judge Simone Bradford had spent her entire life proving she belonged. Now, finally, she was demanding that the world stop making her prove it. 3 weeks after the incident, Brett Callahan's preliminary hearing began. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with journalists, legal observers, community members, and courthouse staff. Security had been tripled, metal detectors placed at every entrance, and guards stationed at intervals throughout the hallway. Judge Harold Klein presided, his demeanor stern and impatient with any disruption. He had made it clear from the beginning that this trial would be conducted by the book, with no special treatment for anyone regardless of their position or the media attention surrounding the case. Amanda Cole stood at the prosecution table, her notes organized, her argument prepared. Across from her sat Brett Callahan and his attorney, Greg Martin, a man known for his aggressive defense tactics and his success in getting officers acquitted even in seemingly clear-cut cases. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They played the video, which had now been watched millions of times but still carried devastating impact when shown in the formal setting of a courtroom. They called witnesses. Tyrell Johnson, the bailiff, testified about the moment Callahan grabbed Judge Bradford, about the warnings that were ignored, about the escalation that could have been avoided at any point. "Did Officer Callahan have any reason to believe Judge Bradford was a threat?" Amanda asked. "None," Tyrell responded firmly. "She was calm, she identified herself, she was wearing her judicial robe. There was no threat, just an officer who decided he knew better than everyone else in the room." LaToya Mitchell, the court reporter, testified about the fear she felt watching the incident unfold. "I've worked in courthouses for 8 years. I've never seen anything like it. Judge Bradford conducted herself with incredible restraint. Officer Callahan was the aggressor from the first moment." Jerome Hayes, the attorney who had stood up that morning, testified about the legal implications. When an officer refuses to accept identification from a judicial officer in their own courtroom, it's not a mistake. It's a deliberate choice to override established authority, and that choice reveals something about who that officer believes deserves respect. Greg Martin cross-examined each witness aggressively, trying to poke holes in their testimony, trying to suggest that hindsight made everything seem clearer than it was in the moment. But the witnesses held firm, their stories consistent, their observations damning. Then the prosecution called Captain Linda Hartley. Her testimony was the turning point. She walked the jury through Callahan's history, the pattern of questionable arrests, the suppressed evidence, the cases that fell apart under scrutiny. She presented the data clinically, without emotion, letting the numbers speak for themselves. "In your professional opinion, Captain Hartley, was Officer Callahan's behavior on the day in question consistent with his previous conduct?" Amanda asked. Hartley looked directly at the jury. "Yes. Officer Callahan has a documented history of making assumptions based on appearance rather than facts. He has repeatedly dismissed information that contradicts his initial assessment of a situation. What happened in Judge Bradford's courtroom was not an aberration. It was a pattern finally captured on camera." The defense objected, arguing that past conduct was irrelevant to the specific charges. Judge Klein overruled, stating that pattern evidence was admissible to show intent and state of mind. When it was the defense's turn, Greg Martin tried to shift the narrative. He called character witnesses who testified to Callahan's years of service, his commendations, his dedication to the job. He called Officer Shane Murphy, who reluctantly testified that he had seen Callahan act professionally in dozens of situations. But under cross-examination, Amanda Cole dismantled that testimony. "Officer Murphy, when you were in that courtroom and multiple people told you Judge Bradford was who she said she was, what did you do?" Murphy shifted uncomfortably. "I stepped back. I didn't want to be involved." "Why?" "Because I realized Brett was wrong, and I didn't want to be part of it." "So you knew he was wrong in the moment, but you didn't stop him?" Murphy looked down. "No, I didn't." "Why not?" Because you don't contradict another officer in public. That's the culture. You back your partner. Amanda let that statement hang in the air before continuing. So the culture is to support fellow officers even when you know they're wrong? Even when they're assaulting a judge? Greg Martin objected, leading the witness. Judge Klein sustained the objection, but the damage was done. The jury had heard exactly what Amanda wanted them to hear. The code of silence that protected bad officers even when their misconduct was obvious. The defense's final strategy was to call Brett Callahan himself to the stand. It was a risky move, but Martin believed his client could explain himself, could make the jury understand that he was just doing his job. Callahan took the stand in full uniform, projecting authority and confidence. Martin walked him through his version of events, which painted him as a dedicated officer following protocol, confronted with an unusual situation, making the best judgment he could under pressure. "Officer Callahan, when you first saw Judge Bradford in the courtroom, what did you think?" Martin asked. "I thought she was someone who had wandered into a restricted area. She wasn't wearing identification, she didn't announce herself through proper channels, and I didn't recognize her." "And when she told you she was a judge, why didn't you believe her?" "Because in my 8 years of experience, I've encountered many people who lie about who they are to gain access to secure areas. I've dealt with imposters, with people trying to disrupt court proceedings, with individuals who present fake credentials. I made a judgment call based on my training and experience." Martin nodded sympathetically. "Were you trying to disrespect Judge Bradford?" "Absolutely not. I was trying to protect the integrity of the courthouse. If I had known she was who she said she was, of course I never would have approached her that way." It was a reasonable-sounding explanation, but Amanda Cole was ready. Her cross-examination was surgical. "Officer Callahan, how many times have you worked courthouse security?" "Approximately 50 days over the past year." "And in those 50 days, how many times have you encountered actual security threats?" Callahan hesitated. "I'm not sure of the exact number." "0, isn't it? You've never encountered a single actual threat during courthouse security duty." "That's because I'm good at my job. I prevent threats." "Or perhaps there simply aren't many threats. Now, Officer Callahan, when Bailiff Johnson told you Judge Bradford was a judge, what did you do?" "I still needed to verify." "But Bailiff Johnson works in that courtroom every day. He would know who the presiding judge is, correct?" "I suppose." "And when Attorney Hayes stood up and told you she was Judge Bradford, what did you do?" "I thought he might be mistaken or trying to protect someone." "And when the court reporter confirmed it?" "Same thing." "So everyone in that courtroom was either mistaken or lying?" "I didn't know what to believe." "Or you knew what to believe, but chose not to believe it because it contradicted your initial assumption. Isn't that more accurate?" Callahan's jaw tightened. "I followed my training." "Your training tells you to grab judges." "My training tells me to secure areas and verify identities." "By putting your hands on people?" "When necessary." Amanda moved closer. "Officer Callahan, in the video, we see you holding Judge Bradford's card. You describe it as suspicious, but it was a legitimate credit card with her name on it, wasn't it?" "I didn't verify that at the time." "Because you didn't try. You just locked it in the safe. Why?" "To preserve evidence." "Evidence of what crime?" Callahan didn't answer immediately. Amanda pressed. "You weren't preserving evidence. You were punishing someone who didn't defer to your authority." "That's not true." "Then explain to this jury why, after multiple people told you who she was, after she showed you identification, after she was standing there in a judicial robe with her name on the bench behind her, you still insisted she didn't belong." Callahan's composure finally cracked. "Because she didn't look like she belonged." The courtroom went silent. Amanda took a step back, letting those words echo. "What does a judge look like, Officer Callahan?" He realized his mistake immediately. "I didn't mean that way. I meant she wasn't dressed formally. She didn't have the usual..." "The usual what?" "I just meant I didn't recognize her." "You didn't recognize her because she's a black woman, and in your experience, judges don't look like black women. Isn't that the truth?" Greg Martin objected loudly. "Your Honor, the prosecutor is putting words in my client's mouth." But Amanda cut him off. I'm asking him to explain his own words. He said she didn't look like she belonged. I'm asking what he meant by that. Judge Klein looked at Callahan. Answer the question. Callahan's face was red, his hands gripping the witness stand. I made a judgment call. It was wrong, but it wasn't about race. It was about security. Amanda looked at the jury. Officer Callahan, in your entire career, have you ever grabbed a white man in a suit and told him he didn't belong in a professional space? I don't recall. Because you haven't, have you? Because when you see a white man in a professional setting, you assume he belongs there. But when you saw Judge Bradford, a black woman, you assume she didn't. That's the definition of racial bias. Objection, Martin shouted. Judge Klein sustained it. Ms. Cole, stick to questions. But the damage was done. The jury had heard Callahan's own words, had seen his defensiveness, had watched him stumble through explanations that revealed exactly what Amanda wanted them to see. When both sides rested, Judge Klein addressed the jury. You have seen and heard the evidence. This case is not about whether Officer Callahan made a mistake. People make mistakes. This case is about whether his actions constituted assault on a judicial officer, whether he acted in contempt of court, and whether he attempted to destroy evidence. The law is clear. An officer does not have unlimited authority to detain or physically restrain someone without cause, and refusing to accept identification from multiple sources does not constitute reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. The word landed in the courtroom like a thunderclap. Guilty of assault on a judicial officer. Guilty of contempt of court. Guilty of attempted destruction of evidence. Brett Callahan's face went white. His hands gripped the edge of the defense table as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Greg Martin immediately stood, requesting that his client remain free on bail pending sentencing. Judge Klein denied the request. Mr. Callahan, you assaulted a sitting judge in her own courtroom and showed no remorse throughout this trial. You are remanded into custody immediately pending sentencing, which will occur in 30 days. 2 bailiffs approached. Callahan stood slowly, his movements mechanical, as they placed him in handcuffs. As he was led from the courtroom, he looked back once toward the gallery, searching for something, support maybe, or understanding. He found neither. The gallery erupted the moment the doors closed behind him. Reporters rushed out to file their stories. Community members embraced, some crying, others simply sitting in stunned silence that justice had actually been served. Outside the courthouse, Amanda Cole gave a brief statement to the press. This verdict sends a clear message. No one is above the law. Not police officers, not anyone. When you abuse your authority, when you let bias guide your actions, there are consequences. A reporter shouted a question. What sentence are you seeking? The maximum allowed under the law. 5 years for the assault charge, plus additional time for the other counts. Officer Callahan had every opportunity to correct his mistake. He chose not to. That choice must carry weight. Across town, in her chambers, Judge Simone Bradford heard the verdict from Tyrell Johnson, who had rushed back from the courthouse to tell her personally. She had not attended the trial, had not wanted her presence to influence the proceedings, but she had followed every moment through transcripts and news reports. Guilty, Tyrell said, slightly breathless from running. On everything. Simone closed her eyes, letting the relief wash over her. Not relief that Callahan had been convicted, though that mattered, but relief that the system for once had worked the way it was supposed to, that evidence had been weighed fairly, that a jury had seen through the defenses and excuses to the truth underneath. Thank you for telling me, she said quietly. Tyrell smiled. Judge, there's something else. The courthouse administration just announced new protocols. Every courtroom will have visible signage identifying the presiding judge. All security personnel will undergo mandatory bias training. And there's going to be an independent oversight committee reviewing any incident where courthouse staff or officers question the credentials of judicial officers or attorneys. Simone looked up. That's more than I expected. It's a start. And they're crediting you, saying that your courage in standing up and demanding accountability made these changes possible. After Tyrell left, Simone sat alone with the weight of what had happened. A man's career was destroyed. He would go to prison. His family would suffer consequences they didn't choose. And while part of her felt the rightness of that outcome, another part recognized the tragedy of it. Because Callahan hadn't been born believing that black women couldn't be judges. He had been taught that subtly, over years, through a culture that reinforced certain assumptions and punished those who challenged them. He had been shaped by a system that rewarded aggression and certainty over humility and questioning. But recognizing that didn't excuse his actions. It only explained them, and explanations without accountability were just excuses. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. "I heard the news. Jerome is crying. He says maybe there's hope for him too." Simone's throat tightened. Her brother, still fighting, still hoping, still believing that somewhere in the system that had stolen 18 years of his life, there might be justice waiting. She texted back. "Tell him I'm not stopping until he's free." That evening, as news of the verdict spread, reactions poured in from across the country. Civil rights organizations issued statements praising the outcome, but emphasizing that one conviction didn't fix systemic problems. Police unions condemned the verdict, arguing that it would make officers afraid to do their jobs. Legal experts debated what the case meant for future accountability measures, but perhaps the most powerful responses came from ordinary people. Teachers who shared the verdict with their students as a lesson about standing up for yourself. Parents who told their children that being right sometimes means being uncomfortable. Young people who saw in Judge Bradford's composed resistance a model for how to demand respect without losing dignity. One video went viral that evening. It showed a high school civics class in Detroit watching the verdict announcement. When the guilty verdict was read, the entire class erupted in cheers. The teacher, a black woman in her 50s, stood at the front of the room with tears streaming down her face. "This is history," she told her students. Not because one officer was convicted, but because a black woman refused to be erased. She stood in her truth, and the system for once recognized that truth. Remember this. Remember that your truth matters, that your presence in spaces you've earned is legitimate, that you don't have to shrink to make others comfortable. Simone watched that video 3 times, each viewing bringing fresh tears, because that teacher had captured something essential. This wasn't just about legal consequences, it was about validation, about a system finally acknowledging what black people, especially black women, had been saying for generations. We are here, we belong here, and we will not accept being told otherwise. 3 days after the verdict, Simone received an unexpected visitor. Captain Linda Hartley requested a meeting, and Simone agreed, curious about what the police captain wanted to say. Hartley arrived in civilian clothes, looking tired and older than her years. She sat across from Simone in chambers and spoke without preamble. "I wanted to apologize, not on behalf of the department, though they should be apologizing too, but personally. I failed you. I failed to see what was happening with Callahan until it was too late. I missed the pattern, dismissed the warning signs, assumed that because there weren't formal complaints, there wasn't a problem." Simone studied her carefully. "Why are you here, Captain?" Hartley met her eyes. "Because I need to do better. My department needs to do better. And I'm asking for your help." "My help?" "We're overhauling our training protocols, bias recognition, de-escalation, accountability measures. But we need input from people who've experienced what you experienced. People who can tell us what we're missing, what we're not seeing. I know I have no right to ask this of you after what happened, but I'm asking anyway." Simone was quiet for a long moment. Part of her wanted to refuse, to tell Hartley that it wasn't her job to fix a broken system. But another part, the part that had become a judge to make the system better, recognized an opportunity. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "But not alone. If I do this, it's with a team of people from communities that have been most impacted by biased policing. Their voices matter more than mine." Hartley nodded immediately. "Agreed, whatever you need." After she left, Simone sat with the complexity of that conversation. She had been asked to help reform the very system that had hurt her. It felt like being asked to teach someone who had attacked you how not to attack others. But wasn't that exactly what justice required? Not just punishment, but transformation. Not just holding people accountable, but creating systems that prevented future harm. She thought about her brother again, about all the years he had lost because a system had failed him. If she could help prevent that from happening to someone else, didn't she have an obligation to try? Her phone rang. It was the attorney working on Jerome's appeal. "Judge Bradford, I have news. We found evidence that was suppressed at his original trial. Witness statements that contradicted the prosecution's timeline. We're filing an emergency motion to vacate the conviction." Simone's heart raced. "How strong is it?" "Strong enough that I think we have a real chance. The prosecutor who handled the original case has a pattern of misconduct that's been documented. We're arguing that the entire trial was tainted." "When will you know?" "The hearing is scheduled for next month, but Judge Bradford, I have to be honest. Even with this evidence, there are no guarantees. The system is resistant to admitting its mistakes." Simone understood that better than anyone. "Do whatever you can. My brother deserves a chance." After she hung up, Simone walked to the window of her chambers and looked out over Chicago. The city stretched in every direction, full of people fighting their own battles, carrying their own stories of justice denied or justice delayed. She had become a symbol of resistance without choosing it, had been thrust into a national conversation without preparation, had been forced to carry the weight of other people's hopes and expectations along with her own trauma and triumph. But as she stood there, watching the sun set over the city, Simone made a conscious choice. She would not run from that responsibility. She would not shrink from the platform she had been given, and she would use every ounce of influence that came from her moment of unwanted fame to make sure the system changed, not just for herself, not just for her brother, but for every person who would come after them, who would walk into spaces they had earned and deserved to be treated with dignity from the first moment, not after proving themselves 1,000 times over. The fight wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But for the first time in years, Judge Simone Bradford felt something that had been missing for too long. She felt like the system, despite all its flaws and failures, might actually be capable of change. And that was worth fighting for. The sentencing hearing for Brett Callahan took place on a cold morning in November, exactly 43 days after his conviction. The courtroom was once again packed, though the energy felt different this time. The initial fury had cooled into something more somber, more reflective. People weren't here for spectacle, they were here for closure. Judge Harold Klein took the bench precisely at 9. He looked over the assembled crowd with the same stern demeanor he had maintained throughout the trial, making it clear that disruptions would not be tolerated. Brett Callahan stood at the defense table, his face gaunt, his uniform replaced by a gray suit that hung loosely on his frame. The weeks in county jail had changed him visibly. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like resignation. Greg Martin, his attorney, stood to address the court first. "Your Honor, my client has cooperated fully with all proceedings. He has no prior criminal record. He spent 8 years serving this community, putting himself in danger to protect others. While the jury found him guilty, we ask the court to consider that Officer Callahan's actions, however misguided, came from a place of attempting to do his job. We request leniency in sentencing." Judge Klein's expression didn't change. "Does your client wish to address the court?" Callahan stood slowly, his hands gripping a piece of paper that trembled slightly. He cleared his throat and began to read, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your Honor, I want to apologize to Judge Bradford, to the court, to everyone affected by my actions. I made a terrible mistake. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and I failed to listen when people tried to correct me. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. I was wrong in how I approached the situation, wrong in how I treated Judge Bradford, and wrong in refusing to admit my error when given the chance." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "I've had a lot of time to think about what happened, about why I acted the way I did. And the truth is, I didn't see Judge Bradford as a person deserving respect. I saw her as a problem to be solved. I made assumptions based on appearance, and I was so certain I was right that I couldn't hear the truth even when it was being spoken directly to me." He looked up from his paper, toward the gallery, though not at anyone specific. "I can't undo what I did, but I want people to know that I understand now. I understand that my badge didn't give me the right to treat people the way I treated Judge Bradford. I understand that the harm I caused goes beyond just that one moment. And I'm sorry, truly sorry." It was the apology many people had been waiting to hear. But it came too late, after conviction, after consequences were already in motion. And for many in the courtroom, it felt less like genuine remorse and more like a last attempt to reduce his sentence. Amanda Cole stood for the prosecution. "Your Honor, the defendant's apology is noted, but actions matter more than words. Officer Callahan had multiple opportunities to apologize, to correct his behavior, to acknowledge his error. He chose not to at every turn. He escalated when he could have de-escalated. He doubled down when he could have admitted fault. And even during trial, he showed no real understanding of the harm he caused." She walked toward the bench, her voice gaining strength. "This case is about more than one officer's mistake. It's about a pattern of behavior that went unchecked for years. It's about a system that allowed Officer Callahan to operate with impunity because the people he targeted didn't have the power to fight back. Judge Bradford only got justice because she had the title, the position, the platform. How many others didn't?" Amanda turned to face Callahan directly. "The prosecution recommends the maximum sentence on all counts, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. Because if there are no real consequences for assaulting a judge, for allowing bias to override duty, for abusing the authority we grant to law enforcement, then we are telling every officer that this behavior is acceptable as long as you don't get caught on camera." Judge Klein listened in silence. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench. "Mr. Callahan, I've reviewed your service record. I've read the letters submitted on your behalf by fellow officers and community members. I've considered your apology and your attorney's arguments for leniency, but I've also reviewed the evidence presented at trial. I've watched the video of your actions, and I've read Captain Hartley's report documenting the pattern of behavior that preceded this incident." He paused, letting his words settle. "What you did was not a mistake. Mistakes are errors in judgment made in good faith under pressure. What you did was a choice. You chose not to believe a judge when she identified herself. You chose not to listen to a bailiff, attorneys, and court staff who told you who she was. You chose to put your hands on her and remove her from her own courtroom. And you chose to double down on those choices even after the truth became undeniable." Judge Klein's expression hardened. "Those choices reveal something deeper than poor judgment. They reveal a mindset that assumes authority based on appearance, a mindset that sees certain people as inherently suspect, as problems to be managed rather than individuals deserving respect. That mindset has no place in law enforcement. It has no place in our justice system, and it certainly has no place in our courthouses." He looked directly at Callahan. "You violated the trust we place in officers. You abused the authority granted to you by the people, and you did so in a manner that strikes at the very foundation of our judicial system. If judges can be assaulted in their own courtrooms without severe consequences, then the rule of law becomes meaningless." Judge Klein picked up his sentencing order. "On the charge of assault on a judicial officer, I sentence you to 5 years in state prison. On the charge of contempt of court, I sentence you to 1 year to run consecutively. On the charge of attempted destruction of evidence, I sentence you to 1 year, also consecutive. Total sentence, 7 years. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Callahan's face went white. Greg Martin immediately stood. Your Honor, we request the court consider probation or work release. Request denied. Judge Klein cut him off. Mr. Callahan will serve his time in custody. He is remanded immediately. 2 bailiffs approached. Callahan turned to look at his attorney, then at the gallery where his family sat. His mother was crying quietly. His father stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. His younger sister had her face in her hands. As Callahan was led away in handcuffs, he looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of consequences he had never believed would apply to him. The courtroom slowly emptied. Some people left in silence, processing what they had witnessed. Others gathered in small groups, discussing the sentence, debating whether it was too harsh or appropriate. Outside, Amanda Cole held another press conference. Justice was served today. Officer Callahan will spend 7 years in prison for assaulting Judge Bradford. This sentence reflects the seriousness of his crimes and sends a message that abuse of authority will not be tolerated. A reporter asked, "Some are saying the sentence is excessive. What's your response?" Amanda's expression was firm. If assaulting a judge in her own courtroom isn't worthy of serious prison time, then what is? Officer Callahan didn't just commit a crime. He attacked the foundation of our justice system. 7 years is appropriate. Another reporter, has Judge Bradford commented on the sentence? Judge Bradford has maintained her focus on her judicial duties. But I can tell you that she has expressed hope that this case leads to meaningful reforms, not just punitive measures. She wants this to be a turning point, not just a footnote. That evening, news of the sentencing dominated headlines. 7 years. It was a significant sentence, longer than most officers ever received, even in cases involving serious violence. The reaction was predictably divided. Civil rights advocates praised the sentence as finally holding law enforcement accountable. Police unions condemned it as excessive and politically motivated. Legal experts debated whether it would set a precedent or remain an outlier. But in communities that had long suffered from biased policing, the reaction was more complex. Relief that justice had been served, skepticism that it would lead to real change, and a haunting question: would this have happened if Judge Bradford hadn't been a judge? If she had been a public defender, a court clerk, an ordinary citizen? The answer, everyone knew, was no. That night, Simone Bradford sat in her living room reading the coverage. She felt no satisfaction from Callahan's sentence. 7 years of someone's life, a family destroyed, a career ended. Even knowing he had brought it on himself, even knowing he had shown no remorse until forced to, she couldn't celebrate it. But she also recognized that consequences mattered, that without them nothing would change, that Callahan's sentence would make other officers think twice before letting bias override duty. Her phone rang. It was her mother. "Baby, did you see? 7 years. "I saw." Your brother called again. He said the attorney is optimistic about the appeal, said the suppressed evidence is strong. Simone closed her eyes. "I'm trying not to hope too much, Mama. We've been disappointed before." "I know, but this feels different. Like maybe your moment is opening doors for others. Like maybe Jerome's time is finally coming." After they hung up, Simone walked to her window and looked out over the city. Somewhere out there, Brett Callahan was beginning his first night in prison. Somewhere, families were celebrating that an officer had finally been held accountable. Somewhere, other officers were gathering, angry and defensive, feeling like they were under attack for doing their jobs. The truth was complicated. Police work was difficult, dangerous, necessary. Most officers did their jobs with integrity, but most wasn't enough. Not when the exceptions caused so much harm. Not when the system protected those exceptions and punished those who spoke up. Real change required more than one conviction. It required cultural transformation, policy reform, sustained accountability. It required people in power to acknowledge that the system was broken and commit to fixing it, even when fixing it was uncomfortable, expensive, and politically risky. Simone thought about Captain Hartley's request for help with training reforms. She had been avoiding giving a firm answer, uncertain whether she wanted to take on that burden. But standing here now, knowing that Callahan would spend 7 years in prison partly because of what he had done to her, she felt the weight of responsibility. She picked up her phone and sent a text to Captain Hartley. "I'll help with the reforms, but I need full transparency, real authority to make changes, and direct access to community advocates. If you can agree to those terms, let's meet." The response came within minutes. "Agreed. Thank you." Simone set down her phone and returned to the window. The city lights stretched endlessly, each one representing a life, a story, a person navigating systems that sometimes protected them and sometimes failed them. She had never asked to become a symbol, had never wanted the attention, the scrutiny, the weight of other people's hopes, but she had been given a platform whether she wanted it or not. And the choice now was whether to use it or hide from it. Judge Simone Bradford had spent her entire career seeking justice for others. Now, in the aftermath of her own moment of injustice vindicated, she had a chance to expand that justice beyond courtrooms and cases. She didn't know if she could succeed, didn't know if the system was truly ready to change, but she knew that refusing to try meant accepting that what happened to her would keep happening to others, and that was unacceptable. So she made her choice. She would fight, she would push, she would use every ounce of influence and credibility she had earned to make the system better. Not because it would be easy, not because she would be thanked for it, but because justice demanded it. And Judge Simone Bradford had dedicated her life to justice. The reforms began slowly, then accelerated as institutional momentum built behind them. Captain Linda Hartley kept her word, granting Simone and a diverse team of community advocates unprecedented access to the Chicago Police Department's training programs and protocols. The team Simone assembled included Rachel Turner, the journalist who had recorded the original video, Terrell Johnson, the bailiff who had stood up when it mattered, 2 public defenders who had spent years watching their clients get profiled, a former police officer who had left the force after witnessing excessive force covered up, and 3 community organizers from neighborhoods most impacted by aggressive policing. Their first meeting took place in a conference room at police headquarters, a location that made several team members visibly uncomfortable. The walls were covered with commendations, photos of officers receiving awards, displays of department history. It was a space designed to celebrate law enforcement, not critique it. Hartley opened the meeting with unexpected humility. "I know having this conversation here in our building is not neutral ground, but I want you to see what we're working with. See the culture we're trying to change. Nothing will be off limits. Ask any question, challenge any practice, propose any reform. My job is to listen and implement." Rachel spoke first. "Why should we trust that this time is different? How many times have departments promised reform after an incident, then quietly returned to business as usual once the attention faded?" It was a direct challenge, but Hartley didn't flinch. "You shouldn't trust us. Not yet. Trust is earned. All I can offer is transparency and action. We've already implemented some immediate changes. Every officer now wears a body camera that can't be turned off during duty hours. We've revised our use of force policy to emphasize de-escalation, and we've terminated 3 additional officers whose personnel files showed patterns similar to Callahan's." One of the public defenders, a woman named Lisa Chen, leaned forward. "What about the union? They're already fighting the reforms. They called Callahan's sentence a travesty of justice. How do you implement changes when the union actively resists accountability?" Hartley's expression hardened. "The union represents officers, but they don't run the department. Superintendent Griffin has made it clear. Officers who can't operate without bias, who can't treat all community members with respect, don't belong in this department. The union can complain all they want. We're moving forward." Simone had been listening quietly, but now she spoke. "The problem isn't just individual officers, it's the culture that forms them. Officers learn from each other, from the stories told in roll call, from what behavior gets rewarded or punished. Real reform means changing that culture, and that requires current officers to admit there's a problem. Hartley nodded. Which is why I want you to speak to them directly, not me explaining what you experienced. You telling them in your own words what it feels like to be on the receiving end of biased policing. The room fell silent. It was a significant ask. For these community members to stand in front of officers, many of whom would be hostile or defensive, and share painful personal experiences. Rachel spoke again. I'll do it, but not just me talking at them. It has to be dialogue. They need to ask questions, challenge assumptions, hear things that make them uncomfortable. Agreed, Hartley said. We'll set up sessions. Small groups, maximum 20 officers at a time. You'll have full control of the format. Over the following weeks, those sessions began. They were difficult, tense, sometimes explosive. Officers pushed back, argued that they were being unfairly vilified, insisted that most of them didn't see race. But slowly, cracks appeared in the defensiveness. An older officer admitted that he had made assumptions similar to Callahan's and gotten away with it because there were no cameras. A younger officer confessed that he had witnessed misconduct but stayed silent because he feared retaliation. A black female officer shared her own experiences of being stopped by fellow officers while off duty, of being treated as suspicious until she showed her badge. Simone attended several sessions, though she didn't always speak. Her presence alone carried weight. Officers knew who she was, knew what had happened to her, and seeing her there, not with anger or accusation but with a genuine desire to make things better, affected them in ways lectures and policy memos never could. One session stood out. A white officer in his 40s named Daniel Foster asked a question that had clearly been bothering him. Judge Bradford, I'm trying to understand. I've worked this job for 20 years. I've never thought of myself as racist. I have black friends, black colleagues, but watching that video, I recognize something in Callahan's behavior. Something I've maybe done in smaller ways without realizing it. How do I fix that? How do I see my own blind spots? Simone considered the question carefully before answering. Start by accepting that having blind spots doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human. We all have biases formed by our experiences, the culture we grew up in, the messages we absorbed without questioning them. The difference between you and Officer Callahan is that you're willing to question yourself. That's where change starts. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But awareness isn't enough. You have to actively work against those biases. When you make an assumption about someone based on how they look, pause. Ask yourself why you made that assumption. Would you make the same assumption about someone who looked different, and most importantly, be willing to be wrong? Be willing to listen when someone tells you your behavior is problematic, even if your intention was good. Foster nodded slowly. That makes sense. But it's hard to change patterns you've been following for decades. It is hard, Simone agreed. Nobody's saying this is easy, but the alternative is continuing to harm people, and that's not acceptable. The session ended with more questions than answers, but there was something different in the room, a willingness to engage, to struggle with difficult truths, to consider that maybe the way things had always been done wasn't the way things should continue to be done. While the police reform work continued, Simone's judicial duties went on. She presided over cases, issued rulings, managed her docket. But something had shifted in how people interacted with her courtroom. Defendants seemed more comfortable, more willing to speak up, more trusting that they would be heard. Attorneys, particularly public defenders, brought motions challenging police conduct with renewed confidence, and prosecutors, aware that the world was watching, seemed more careful about the cases they brought and the officers they relied on. One case particularly resonated. A young black man named Dante Williams was charged with resisting arrest after an encounter with police outside his own apartment building. The officers claimed he was acting suspiciously and refused to show identification. Video footage told a different story. The footage showed Dante coming home from work, still in his security guard uniform, being approached by two officers who demanded to know what he was doing in the building. When he explained that he lived there and reached for his keys to prove it, the officers interpreted his movement as threatening and tackled him. Simone watched the video 3 times. Each viewing made her angrier, not with explosive fury but with cold certainty. This was exactly what had happened to her, scaled down but fundamentally identical. An assumption that someone didn't belong in a space they had every right to be. She ruled from the bench. The charges against Mr. Williams are dismissed with prejudice. He was on his own property, engaging in lawful behavior when he was accosted by officers who made assumptions based on appearance rather than facts. The officers' actions were unjustified, and Mr. Williams's response was reasonable under the circumstances. She looked directly at the two officers present in court. You are required to attend the bias recognition training currently being implemented by your department. Your supervisor will be notified of this ruling and its basis, and I am formally recommending that the prosecutor's office review all arrests you've been involved with to ensure this wasn't an isolated incident. The officers left the courtroom red-faced and angry, but Dante Williams walked out free, vindicated with his record cleared. As he passed Simone on his way out, he stopped and said quietly, "Thank you for seeing me." Those 4 words carried the weight of every time he hadn't been seen, every time someone had looked at him and made assumptions, every interaction where he had to prove he wasn't a threat just for existing. Later that day, Simone received a call from her brother's attorney. Her hands shook as she answered. "Judge Bradford, I have news. The appellate court reviewed the suppressed evidence. They've vacated Jerome's conviction." Simone couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. 18 years. Her brother had spent 18 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. "He's being released tomorrow," the attorney continued. "All charges dropped. The state is not pursuing a retrial. Jerome is coming home." Simone made arrangements to fly to Atlanta immediately. That night, she sat on a plane trying to process 18 years of stolen time, of holidays missed, of milestones uncelebrated, of a life put on hold because a system had failed catastrophically. But Jerome was coming home. And while nothing could give back what had been taken, at least the injustice was being acknowledged, corrected, ended. She thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. If Callahan hadn't assaulted her, if the video hadn't gone viral, if the case hadn't sparked national conversation about bias in the justice system, if attorneys hadn't been emboldened to challenge wrongful convictions more aggressively, would Jerome still be in prison? The answer was probably yes. And that truth was both devastating and clarifying. One moment of injustice being exposed had created ripples that touched lives far beyond her own. Jerome Bradford walked out of Georgia State Prison at dawn, carrying a clear plastic bag containing the few possessions he had accumulated over 18 years. He was 41 years old but looked older, his hair graying at the temples, lines etched deeply around his eyes. He wore street clothes provided by the prison, jeans and a plain shirt that didn't quite fit. Simone stood at the gate with their mother and younger sister, Nicole. The moment Jerome saw them, his composure cracked. He dropped the bag and ran, pulling all 3 women into an embrace that felt like it might never end. "You're out," Simone whispered against his shoulder. "You're really out." Jerome couldn't speak. He just held them, his body shaking with sobs that had been held back for nearly 2 decades. They drove to their mother's house in silence, Jerome staring out the window at a world that had changed dramatically since he had last been free. Smartphones, electric cars, buildings that hadn't existed before. He was a stranger in his own city. Over the following days, Jerome slowly adjusted to freedom. Simple things overwhelmed him. Choosing what to eat for breakfast, walking outside without permission, using a phone that wasn't monitored, sleeping in a bed with sheets that weren't prison issue. But the hardest part was the anger. It simmered beneath his quiet demeanor, threatening to boil over when he thought too hard about what had been stolen from him. One evening, he and Simone sat on the back porch of their mother's house, watching the sun set. Jerome finally voiced what had been building inside him. 18 years, Simone. They took 18 years of my life for something I didn't do. And the people who did it, the prosecutor who hid evidence, the detective who coached witnesses, they're still out there. No consequences. They just move on while I try to figure out how to live in a world that forgot I existed. Simone listened, letting him speak. And you know what the worst part is? Jerome continued. Nobody even apologized. The state dropped the charges, but no one said sorry. No one acknowledged that they destroyed my life, Mom's life, your life. They just processed the paperwork and opened the door. He turned to look at her. How do you do it? How do you work in that system every day knowing what it did to me, to so many others? Simone chose her words carefully. Because leaving means letting them win. If everyone who sees the system's failures walks away, nothing changes. I stay because I remember you. Every person who stands in front of my bench, I see you. And I try to make sure what happened to you doesn't happen to them. Jerome was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, What happened to you? That officer putting his hands on you, not believing you were a judge. That's what they did to me every day for 18 years. Told me I was lying, that I was where I belonged, that my word didn't matter. At least you had witnesses, cameras, proof. I had nothing but my voice, and it wasn't enough. Your voice is enough now, Simone said firmly. People want to hear your story. The lawyers who got you out, they're talking about a civil suit against the state. You could get compensation, maybe not enough to make up for what was taken, but something. Jerome shook his head. I don't want their money. I want them to admit they were wrong. I want the prosecutor disbarred. I want the detective who framed me to face consequences. I want justice, not a settlement. Simone understood, because money didn't give back time. Apologies didn't erase trauma, and settlements came with gag orders that prioritized protecting institutions over acknowledging harm. Then we fight for that, she said, however long it takes. Back in Chicago, the reforms Simone had helped implement were beginning to show results. Complaints about officer misconduct had decreased by 30% in 3 months. Community trust, measured through surveys and focus groups, was slowly improving, and officers who underwent the new training reported feeling better equipped to handle tense situations without escalation. But resistance remained fierce. The police union continued to push back, filing grievances about the new oversight boards and calling the bias training initiative political theater. On talk radio and certain TV networks, commentators began spinning the story. The good cop destroyed by cancel culture, the angry judge using her bench for revenge. Simone knew that narrative well. It was how reform always fought for air in America. Still, for every voice defending the old ways, there were 10 more demanding better ones. Community town halls were packed again. Law students cited Bradford versus Callahan in papers about structural bias. And in classrooms from Chicago to Atlanta, children were learning her name as part of civics lessons about justice and courage. At home in Atlanta, Jerome tried to rebuild his life. Reporters wanted interviews, podcasts offered money, documentaries wanted rights. He declined them all. I don't want to be a headline, he told Simone. I just want to breathe. She understood, though she also knew his story could open minds that data never could. One evening, she found him sitting in the backyard, staring at the horizon. You know, he said, I keep thinking about that officer, the one who grabbed you. He's in prison now, right? Yes. He probably tells himself the system failed him. Same thing I told myself for years. Simone nodded. Maybe the system did fail him, just in a different way. It taught him the wrong lessons about power and belonging. Jerome exhaled slowly. So what now? Now, she said, we build something better. He looked at her, half smiling. Then maybe it was all for something. In Chicago, the reforms kept deepening. A year-long review identified 43 prior arrests where bias played a documented role. Those convictions were vacated. The department launched an anonymous reporting portal for officers who witnessed misconduct. And for the first time in city history, civilian advocates, two of them from Simone's reform team, were granted permanent seats on the internal disciplinary board. Nationally, other jurisdictions followed: Seattle, Baltimore, Newark. Each quietly replicated elements of the Bradford Protocol, a new training standard emphasizing verification over assumption, de-escalation over dominance. But for Simone, the most personal victory arrived 6 months later when Jerome spoke at a university law symposium titled Justice Reimagined. Standing at the podium, still awkward in a suit he hadn't worn in 20 years, he said, "My sister taught me that justice isn't a gift, it's a muscle. You build it every time you refuse to back down." The audience rose to its feet, and in that moment, Simone finally allowed herself to feel something she hadn't since the morning Callahan grabbed her shoulder in courtroom 6B Peace. A year after the verdict, Chicago felt different. Not healed nothing that deep heals quickly but awake. Billboards around the city displayed the department's new motto: serve, protect, respect. Officers wore body cams as naturally as their uniforms now. Community advisory panels met monthly. Complaints were still filed, but more were resolved transparently than ever before. Judge Simone Bradford's courtroom had become a quiet symbol of that change. The press had long moved on to newer scandals, yet visitors still slipped into the gallery just to see her work. They found no theatrics, just fairness. On a gray February morning, Simone entered courtroom 6B, now fitted with a bronze plaque near the door. This courtroom became the starting point of reform after the events of May 12, 2024, dedicated to accountability, courage, and the pursuit of equal justice. She paused before it each day, a private reminder that pain could plant the seeds of progress. Tyrell Johnson, still her bailiff, greeted her with a grin. "Morning, Judge. The docket's heavy but mercifully sane." "I'll take sane," she replied, setting her coffee beside the bench. Halfway through the session, she noticed a teenager sitting nervously in the gallery with a school notebook on her lap. During recess, the girl approached. "Judge Bradford, I'm Maya. My civics teacher showed us your video, the one from back then. I want to be a lawyer someday, maybe a judge." Simone smiled warmly. "Then promise me 2 things. Listen before you judge, and never let anyone tell you where you don't belong." Maya nodded, eyes bright. "Yes, ma'am." When the day ended, Simone returned to her chambers where Captain Hartley awaited her, portfolio in hand. "Final report," Hartley said. "Complaints of biased conduct down 52%. Excessive force incidents cut nearly in half. It's not perfect, but it's real." Simone scanned the pages. "It's more than numbers. It's proof that accountability works." Hartley hesitated. "Some officers still resent you. They think you made them the enemy." "I didn't make them anything," Simone said quietly. "Their choices did, but if they're angry because they're being asked to think before acting, I can live with that." The 2 women shook hands, partners now, not adversaries. That weekend, Simone flew to Atlanta for a family gathering. Jerome had started teaching criminal justice courses at a local community college. Their mother beamed as he grilled food in the backyard, laughing with neighbors who'd followed his story. "Can you believe this?" he asked Simone. "I've got students asking me how to fix the system that broke me." "You're doing it," she said. "Every class you teach is a repair." Later that night, when the crowd thinned, they sat on the porch again. "I used to think justice meant winning," Jerome said. "Now I think it means making sure nobody else loses the way we did." Simone reached for his hand. "That's the truest definition I've heard." Back in Chicago, spring arrived with cautious optimism. The Bradford Reform Act, a state-level bill mandating independent oversight of courtroom security and officer conduct reviews, passed both chambers with bipartisan support. Simone declined the invitations to speak at the signing ceremony. "This isn't about me," she told reporters. "It's about what we learned." Yet her absence didn't diminish her presence. Editorials praised her restraint, her refusal to politicize what had begun as trauma. Universities invited her to guest lecture on judicial ethics. Young prosecutors cited her in dissertations on implicit bias. Even Hollywood came calling, but she turned them down politely. Real justice doesn't fit neatly into a 2-hour movie, she said. Then, one rainy evening, she received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a letter written in neat, familiar handwriting. Judge Bradford, this is Brett Callahan. I'm writing from State Correctional Facility. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted to tell you that I finally understand. The classes they make us take here, bias awareness, restorative justice, they forced me to face parts of myself I didn't know existed. I saw the video again during training. Watching it this time, I didn't see a security threat. I saw fear my own, fear of being wrong, fear of losing control. I don't ask for absolution. I only hope that when I get out, I can work to prevent others from becoming who I was. Thank you for holding me accountable. Brett Callahan. Simone read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. She didn't know whether to feel closure or sadness, maybe both. Accountability, she realized, wasn't about destroying a person, it was about forcing truth into the open so it could be faced. Months later, during a national judicial conference in Washington, D.C., Simone was asked to deliver the keynote address. She stood before a hall filled with judges, attorneys, and lawmakers. Her speech was simple. Justice isn't static, she began. It breathes through us. Every decision we make either strengthens it or suffocates it. A year ago, I learned how fragile that breath can be, but I also learned how resilient it becomes when people choose to act with courage instead of comfort. She paused, scanning the room. The moment we start believing bias can't touch us is the moment it wins. So keep questioning, keep listening. And when you see injustice, whether in a courtroom or in a hallway, don't wait for cameras to make it matter. Make it matter yourself. The room erupted in applause. But as Simone left the stage, what touched her most wasn't the praise, it was the quiet line of young clerks waiting to shake her hand, each one saying some version of, "You made me believe I belong here." That night, alone in her hotel room, Simone stood by the window watching the city lights. She thought about everything that had unfolded: the arrest, the trial, the reforms, her brother's freedom, even Callahan's letter. The chain of pain and progress was messy, imperfect, human. Yet somewhere between the outrage and the reforms, between the verdict and her brother's release, something profound had happened. The system had learned. Maybe not enough, maybe not fast, but it had learned. Simone smiled softly. Tomorrow she'd fly home, step back into courtroom 6B, and start another docket, new cases, new people, the endless rhythm of justice. But tonight, for the first time in years, she allowed herself a simple, radical belief. That change, once unimaginable, was now possible, and that the bench she returned to each morning was no longer just a seat of authority. It was proof that standing your ground, even when the world refuses to see you, can bend history toward the truth.